Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon. I'm the CEO and co-founder with Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we've built some of the best-in-class, asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools. We've been working with life science companies from across the globe over the past 13 years to help them do everything from virtualizing their advisory board meetings, investigator teams, steering committees, medical education. And since the launch of our Insight Events platform, we've been helping companies with virtual conferences, sales meetings, hackathons, and everything in between. But more importantly at Impetus, we really believe that everything starts with a conversation. And from these big, hairy, audacious conversations with some of the leading edge thinkers, the bleeding edge tech entrepreneurs, provocateurs, we can all work to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. But it doesn't just start with a conversation. We need to work to sustain it. This is precisely the reason at Impetus where we have a series of ongoing touch points with stakeholders so that we can move the agenda forward. So I'm really pleased to have one of these leading edge thinkers who's doing tons of great work in the life sciences space. This is actually Chris Garabedian, and he is actually the founder of a company called Xontogeny. It's a really interesting name, and we're going to want to find out where Xontogeny, the name, came from. It was founded in 2016, and it was used to support multiple promising technologies from early development through clinical proof of concept. In 2017, Chris joined a company called Perceptive Advisors, and they were there to develop their venture fund, and a strategy basically was used to launch the Perceptive Xontogeny Venture Fund in 2018. And this fund is being used to support early stage companies seeded and incubated at Xontogeny and other ventures. So very exciting work. So, doing all kinds of things in this very burgeoning and important space. Chris has a broad base of experience and a track record of success over his decades-long experience in the biopharma industry. Among many things, Chris served as the president and CEO of Sarepta Therapeutics from 2011 to 2015, where he oversaw the turnaround of a company that is now a commercial stage leader in the genetic technology space. And before that, Chris led corporate strategy for Celgene and served in a number of global commercial and corporate development leadership roles at Gilead. So all names that we know, and certainly ones that we've heard of since COVID-19. Chris serves on several boards of life science companies and speaks at industry conferences on a wide range of important issues. Chris is also the board of directors at MassBio and serves as a senior advisor from the Boston Consulting Group. Welcome, Chris. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Natalie. It's really a pleasure to be on your show, and thanks for that nice introduction.
Absolutely. I have to say, what an absolutely impressive resume. You've done it all. Whatever got you to decide to move from a very comfortable, wonderful world that's predictable and lovely and lots of money flowing in the biopharma space to go out there, start a venture fund, and start working with early seed companies? Like what drove you to where you are today?
Yeah, I think it was a slow evolution, right? In early part of your career, you're given projects, assignments, right? An area to lead, and you learn a lot after spending years in an industry. I was really fortunate that I picked really good companies, right? That were really growth stage, and so the best way to learn about an industry is to be part of a growing organization where there's always too much to do. There's always too many things to think about strategically, a lot of activities, and usually that comes with a track record of success. So learning how to do things the right way, right? And being able to work side by side with some of the best minds and experienced professionals in the industry. You learn something after being exposed to those folks over now almost 3 decades for me. So I think the reason I pivoted to really focus on early stage companies working with entrepreneurs, first-time CEOs, scientific founders, is that I felt that there was a lack of industry experienced talent to populate the thousands of companies that are startups. And, it's really hard to find management teams that can do, a really good job with those technologies. And one of the reasons I believe we see 90+% failure rates. So what I wanted to do was partly give back, take all that experience I had, and figure out how I could leverage that across a portfolio of companies, but importantly, providing that advisement, that mentoring, that coaching for the next generation of CEOs, where we can help them make the right decisions and they can learn, what good looks like, right? As they are earlier on in their careers.
Oh, what a brilliant thing to do, and a wonderful thing to be bringing back all of those decades long of experience and bringing it to people who really need it. So tell us a little bit about the skill set. So you're saying finding great management teams to start leading these companies, and again, a really high failure rate. It sounds very similar to the failure rate you see in clinical trials. Actually, it's 11% actually make it through. So it sounds like 11 or 10 or 11% of actually biotech companies make it through. I wonder if the clinical studies are correlate of that. But what is it that makes somebody special? What is that secret sauce, if you will, of the people that really make it and the ones that don't?
Yeah, well, the 90+% failure rates was really indicative of the products that are brought into clinical development with an open IND, how many of those make it across FDA approval. And even then, those products that get FDA approved, they're not always best in class or blockbusters, right? So you even have failures for those that make it across the finish line. But even more daunting than those statistics are those that are in preclinical stage and might have great data in a rodent model, right? We see those sometimes on the nightly news that we've cured a mouse of some disease. Well, the failure rate for those products that look good in an early model is like 99% failure. So, so what is it that are the skills that are required? Well, I believe it's a misperception about separating out what a good researcher is, a good lab researcher, scientist who might run a mean lab experiment and might have a great number of publications, and that is a important but distinct discipline from what I call the D of R&D, right? So research is great, but if you don't get the development right, you're going to end up seeing more failure. And so the development, the way I view it, and what I've learned in my experience in the industry, is that this is a very different discipline than just being a good scientist. It is the art and practice of good drug development. And I think this has a lot to do with program design and experimental design and clinical trial design. And another way of saying that is that this runs through from the choices you make in your first translational disease models. What's the range of doses you're going to look at? Are you going to look at more than one analog? What are the criteria that is going to lead you to believe you've got a more active drug? Where does that lead you to the next experiment? What are the right markers you're looking at? Are you comparing it to a good positive control, right? Do you have confidence and reliability that the phenotypic characteristics of that model are appropriate if you're looking at an animal study? So these are things that you really need to be thoughtful from the beginning. And this leads to the right regulatory strategy. How do you approach the FDA with the right questions, right? And this ultimately leads to what range of doses in your healthy volunteer studies are you going to look at? How do you get to the right therapeutic window to avoid toxicities, but still have the most active drug? And that ultimately leads to what we believe is the right North Star of good drug development, which is that first clinical study in patients in a given disease. How you design that, right? What are the right inclusion exclusion criteria? What are the right statistical methods that you're going to apply? How do you power it the right way? What are the secondary endpoints, biomarkers, real world evidence, patient reported outcomes? It's designing that definitive proof of concept study that becomes beyond reproach, where anybody from industry or somebody who knows that field very well can look at that and say, wow, this is a well-designed study and I can trust the data that comes out of it. So that's in a quick summary of that, is that the science of drug development, right, is what separates, in my mind, right, the winners from the losers, right? Now, I will say this, there are certain technologies that it almost doesn't matter how good of a drug development, they're so elegantly designed, it's a lock and key, right, approach, right? Gleevec is a good example. There's been books written about this for CML, hematologic malignancies. And there's also those that no matter what you do, you could be the best drug development team the industry has to offer, and it will fail because you won't be able to elucidate those drug-like characteristics until you're in a clinical trial, right? Whether it's a safety issue, whether it's engaging the target in a human biological system, right, versus a mouse or a, another species. So that is where we focus our energy, and why we started Xontogeny, pronounced with a Z. We started that to bring together good drug developers and to provide that kind of direction and oversight into companies that needed that expertise.
Lovely, and I love it. What is the name Xontogeny? What does it mean, and why did you pick that name?
Yeah. So as I was thinking about what I wanted to do for what I hope is the last kind of leg of my biotech career, I realized that what I learned across my career was that that a lot of times when I was at Gilead and Celgene, we would meet with early stage biotechs who wanted us to do a partnership deal or wanted us to acquire them, right? Or wanted us to, do an R&D program together. And inevitably, we would look at what they had done and we were disappointed. We were like, oh, why did you design that study that way? Oh, how come you didn't do this model, right? Oh, how come you didn't anticipate those regulatory issues that you should have foreseen were going to be problems? Why did you use that contract manufacturer, right, when it was a failed lot and you could have avoided that by going with a known one, right? So we would always see these choices that these early stage biotech teams would make, and we were just shaking our head saying, oh, if only we were involved from the beginning, if only we could have been there when they started this company. And ultimately, if you look back at the 40-year history of the biotech industry, most would say that the industry was founded in 1980 when Genentech went public and when all of these technologies from the 1970s started to become companies, right? And if you look past the last 40 years of the industry, nothing has really beaten the return on investment and the data sets that are held in the highest esteem when you take a preclinical asset and move it through a clinical proof of concept. At that point, when you have a great successful data set in patients, right, this North Star that I was talking about, nobody questions it. They're almost fait accompli. This is going to be FDA approved. Look how great this data is. That's when you open up the Wall Street Journal and you see a biotech stock up 200% in one day. It's usually because they've finally shown clinical data in patients, right? So as I thought about this, I said, I want to focus all of my energy and attention on helping companies from inception, from the genesis of that company, when it was an idea, that I want to help these biotech companies, right, grow organically with the right direction until maturity, until they're ready to either be acquired by a big pharma company, whether they can go public. So this idea of taking something from inception, right, to maturity is a concept in biology called ontogeny, ontogenesis. So ontogeny of taking something from genesis, beginning, inception to maturity, when they can live on their own, they can fly on their own. Everybody says they're fine. They don't need any more coaching, right? that's what I wanted to do with biotech companies. So branding, there was a healthcare product called Xontogeny. I said, well, how do I do this? So I decided to just put an X in the front and pronounce with a Z. You know, you can look
just
at the
to add some extra glamour to it. And
yeah, and I could get a domain name. I could get a website, right? Because Ontogeny wasn't available. So so that's how it started. But the concept, though, is really what underlies it, which is being involved in those early stages when you know, providing that, you know, parentage, you know, providing that guiding hand, right, is really, really critical.
I absolutely love this, Chris. Now, here's the thing that's interesting. You didn't set yourself up in Boston by coincidence. I mean, Boston seems to be this really interesting epicenter, or it's like the Silicon Valley, if you will, of biotech, just like California, Miami, Austin is now for the tech industry. It's a tough place to be. Biotech is slow. There's more regulation, there's more everything that you could ever imagine, you know, and it's a really tough place to be. Why don't you actually tell us a little bit about you know, why you see this as an investor, but why this is so much harder and so much more rewarding than, for example, being a tech investor?
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, I don't know tech as well, so I'm not going to comment on the differences and the contrast there. But I can tell you, with tech, you don't need as much capital, and you can have a programmer in their basement knocking out a great new app that can go viral, right? We know that that doesn't happen in biotech. You can't have somebody tinkering in the lab and then all of a sudden everybody's using it as a drug, right? So part of the thing about biotech is what appeals to me, right, is the complexity of this, right? First of all, just the technology development, right, is very complex, a lot of moving parts. You have to think about the 1,000 different trade-offs in your head. What's possible, right? How do you shape a product with the right, you know, drug-like characteristics or characteristics if you're dealing with a device or, you know, a diagnostic. And so there's a lot of design, as I talked about, but then you also have thinking about the competitive landscape. What is the current standard of care and treatment in an area? Well, you need to do better than that, right? You have to think about what are the data sets that will ultimately be looked at by the healthcare professionals, usually a doctor who's writing a prescription. Well, that's not the end user. The end user is the patient. So you got to think about, well, what's that patient-doctor interface going to look like? And how do I convince the doctor, right, with the data set where he's recommending that to his or her patient, right? And so ultimately, that is where the complexity of you're developing a drug that is going to be prescribed by somebody to the ultimate end customer. And are they going to be satisfied? Are they going to come back to the physician's office and say, I'm having side effects and I don't want to take this drug anymore? Okay, so you have to think about the whole chain of custody from the beginning, but you have this big gator, okay, kind of the gating item is the FDA. So your ultimate customer as a drug developer is the FDA, because the FDA decides whether they even allow your technology and your drug to get into the hands of physicians. And then you have the complexity of, okay, well, nobody's going to, very few can pay out of pocket for these technologies that are cutting edge, innovative, maybe curative for disease. So now you have to convince the payers to not put you on the shelf for, you know, emergency use only, but how do you get payers to say, yeah, we'll actually allow this drug to be widely utilized in this patient population, and we'll reimburse it so that the patient doesn't feel the pinch, or they can even get access to it. So the complexity of all of these things in our industry is what makes it so exciting and appealing for me, because, you know, as a problem solver, right, that's ultimately what you're excited about, right? So that, but just to highlight Boston, and, you know, I think you're right, it is the Silicon Valley of biotech. And I think that there's a few key ingredients that make a hub, an ecosystem really ripe for biotech. And Boston has all of these in spades. One is the academic research, right, that's going on. You've got, some of the foremost institutions, MIT and Harvard, right across the river from where I'm speaking now. You've got multiple top tier clinical research institutions where some of the cutting edge research is done out of the hospitals here, from Mass General to Brigham and Women's to, right, Boston's Children's Hospital to Dana-Farber Institute, right? We have so many that make the top 10, top 20, nationally or worldly, right? You have money here, right? You have some of the biggest investors, both in venture capital and in public equity investing. I'd say as high profile names are here in Boston as are in New York or even in, Silicon Valley. You have the talent pool, which is really critical. We've had a lot of big successful companies, from Biogen to Vertex to Genzyme to my former company Sarepta and Alnylam, and there's just been many where the companies that have learned how to be successful getting drugs approved, well, that's the talent pool that biotech needs, and we have a longer list of those successful companies than any other biotech hub. So I think all of these things kind of converge together to make it a really exciting ecosystem. However, while I'm here and most of my team is here, our whole model is predicated that, hey, we can do this virtually. We can export all of this great talent and experience to wherever your technology came from, wherever you might be headquartered, right? So we just announced 5 seed deals. 3 of them are in the Philadelphia area. 1 of them is in North Carolina. 1 of them is Illinois, right? And we're saying, hey, most of this is outsourced anyway, and we can do a lot of great drug development, and we can help you with the strategy and with the design and the regulatory strategy, all of that. We can do that here in Boston, and you don't have to be here in proximity for us to make that work. And we think that is a really nice thing for entrepreneurs to hear, that, oh, I don't have to move to Kendall Square across from, the Broad and the Koch Institute and the Whitehead Institute. I can actually stay in my area where there might be some great research going on, but there may not be that talent pool of biotech drug developers.
So important and so relevant and so succinctly said, Chris. I mean, I oftentimes quote Scott Galloway, calls this the era of the great dispersion. We've seen all kinds of things, big companies moving. There's just been incredible changes, digital transformation, geopolitical unrest, economic changes, and all sorts of things happening. And so there's silver linings in it, and there's these groundswells of momentum under various people's tailwinds. What I think you said that's really brilliant here is the fact that there's an inclusion and a diversity that now is going to be potentially participating in the Perceptive Xontogeny Venture Fund, which I realize, and congratulations for just closing. I think it was over 500 million with those early stage companies that you've just stated, and probably many more to come. What does this now mean? Is this now opening the doors, democratizing things in a much more broad scope way? What other kinds of companies from a national, international standpoint, and what does this mean for Xontogeny?
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting how, COVID forcing everybody to go virtual and remote, everybody quickly realized that, okay, wow, we can be as productive, if not more productive, right? Working, right, with people where we don't have to fly people into a city and shuttle them into a conference room and trade business cards and shake hands, and all of the expense and the waiting at the airport gates and waiting in line at the hotel and taking your Uber right to the meeting room. Like, all of that can be done when we just click on our computer and we're right there interacting with a team. So one, that gave us even more confidence that we can do this type of work, right, with people that aren't here in Boston or in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Kendall Square, right? But you're absolutely right. The opening up of being able to work with talent, right, anywhere, right, even outside of the country. We have a couple companies already from Canada that we've invested in from the first fund, and so and I know that's near and dear to your heart, and so we're excited about that. And so, I think that we're increasingly looking at opportunities that are from, Europe and South America and Israel and Asia, right? So I think this does democratize, right? That good ideas and good technologies can come from anywhere. And, the other thing is that most of drug development, and I would say, technology development is outsourced, right? If you even look at the large pharma companies, right? They'll have staff that's managing those outsourced service providers, but contract manufacturing is often in biotech. It's almost a commonplace, right? Contract research organizations, whether it's preclinical to do your IND enabling toxicology to get the drug into the clinic, whether it's a disease model that might be a special proprietary model where you have to go to either Jackson Labs or you have to go to an academic center. Everything is outsourced, and, phase 1 trials for healthy volunteers, that might be in Kansas or Wisconsin, right? So when you realize that everything is outsourced or can be outsourced, right? Well, why do we need a bunch of people centered in one little geographic, right, office setting to get stuff done, right? And so that really does open up, right, access to better talent, access to better technologies, right? And it's efficient, right? We're not requiring people to, oh, you need to move, you need to fly over here, right? So I think that the COVID experience has accelerated that and increased the comfort and confidence that we all have in being able to do it well. We have companies we've invested in. I haven't met the teams, but I've met with them virtually more times than I would ever have met with them physically. Right.
Yeah. And we actually have to, concur with you, because as you know, that's what our company does. We do a series of these asynchronous and synchronous to get agendas forward and to build policy and what have you. And people learning that trust and relationships can actually be developed virtually, which is really, really interesting. So I just want to step aside for a few minutes. And we talked a lot about the entrepreneur, the scientific founders, they're people that are coming to your accelerator to help them take their little baby and help it to grow and to do the things that it needs to do so that it can be one of the success stories. What are they going to, so you also talked about a whole bunch of stuff around setting them up properly for the clinical proof of concept, which is so absolutely important. You talked a lot around the trials that people do, the endpoints that they pick. It's not going to quite cut it with the FDA. And the other piece to this is COVID-19, the pandemic. It has truly tested a lot of people's clinical trial resiliency. A lot of trials had to stop. Some people had to abruptly pivot, go back to IRBs. Yep. What did you learn before and after around the resiliency of endpoints, the utilization of things like eCOAs, e-consents, use of technology, remote monitoring, wearables? How has your guidance around getting the right sort of clinical proof changed maybe before and after this pandemic?
Yeah, well, what I would say is that there was an acceleration of things that were already in place, that there was some inertia. The FDA required, CRF filings, a few years back. So, everybody had already gotten to the idea that there's a lot of electronic, right, exchange of information, right? But there was a hesitancy, and this tends to happen with especially the large companies that have been doing things a certain way for, decades, right? Often, for them to resist change. And usually that ends up being right. To be the conservative one that waits until everybody else is doing it. Okay, this is probably something we should catch up on. And we've got the money and the wherewithal to catch up. And, they're usually not the ones that are the first ones, running through the wall, right, for change. What I think COVID did was it became one of those beautiful crises moments, right, where they're like, we have to figure this out. How are we going to capture data if we can't send patients to that clinic, right? Or how are we going to, and it made them think, especially after it lasted more than a month or two, right? That's when they realized, like, okay, we can't just shut down our business So we better evolve and adapt quickly, right? The real beauty of this is that the FDA was primed, right, for this. They had already been talking policy issues. They had been encouraging industry to start thinking about real world evidence and patient reported outcomes and alternative ways and adaptive trial design. And to their credit, they came out quick to issue guidelines to say, hey, we're going to be flexible. We know this isn't perfect. And we know that we have often been, sticklers, right, for complete data sets, right? And that, we would ding you previously, right, if you had some missing data. Well, we know we're in a new game here. And so we're not going to be as severe on industry sponsors when they've missed some, clinical visits because of COVID, right? And I think that came out early, and that gave the industry some comfort and confidence that by barreling through, they weren't taking undue risk, right? Where they were going to spend all this money, try to collect data, and then the FDA was going to say, balk at that, right? So I think that this converged to give the industry a lot of confidence. And biotech, which, you mentioned earlier that you could almost equate biotech failures with clinical failures. Well, that's because when a biotech raises money, 80% of that is going toward the development of their lead program, right? So they had all this cash, and those investors said, well, are we going to hit our milestones? Like, how do we, we can't just keep, paying for operations and not gathering data, right? So everybody, including ourselves, we looked at our portfolio and said, okay, how do we continue to meet our milestones to keep this program going forward? And that's when people started doing that and having successful meetings with the FDA. Drugs have been approved during this period, data sets have been locked and completed. And that made people realize that, okay, this isn't a major, right, bump in the road, right? I mean, it's a small bump, right? So I think that that accelerated a lot of things where now the largest companies and the smallest companies are saying, okay, how do we do this now for the next study and the next study, right? So I think it really did accelerate a lot of this virtual / digital / alternative endpoints, right? Remote-based monitoring, wearable endpoint, like how do you figure out how to incorporate those? And I don't think we're there yet where those become the definitive primary endpoints that are the basis of approval. But I think we've moved much closer to when we look at those combined data sets of old school, clinical trial going into an office every 3 months versus capturing, real world evidence. Once those start to converge and they start to be correlated, you can start to replace the old methods with the new methods. I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. It takes time, but the pathway is there and we're seeing evidence. Certainly the speed at which the FDA and other regulatory bodies have modified their usual protocols to make decisions quicker. And you're starting to see documentation, protocols, all sorts of things just really coming through, which is very promising. So I'm just curious, on that note, the other piece that's really accelerating is the piece around adoption of technologies as a therapeutic, software as a medical device, the application of 510Ks and other sorts of things. So I'm curious, in your world, as an accelerator in the biotech space, is there a space for these software companies, either as sole companies or in partnership with the other biotechs, to come in and access the same level of regulatory and other kinds of operations insights from your accelerator, because you provide all kinds of things, CROs, marketing, tell us a little bit about, is there room for software as a medical device, or are you just dealing with bio? Yeah. And, what does this world of service provision or operations support does Xontogeny provide?
Yeah, well, so I've been saying this for many years now, which is, I think the key to success of what some have called convergence, the convergence of tech with healthcare, right? Or biotech and traditional technology tools, right? I mean, emerging technology tools, original, traditional tech, is that it doesn't work when it's trying to come from within traditional biotech, because they don't have that mindset. They don't understand the technologies. They're not in Silicon Valley talking to all the fellow programmers at different companies. So they don't necessarily have the best understanding of how these can be applied, what the limitations are, where they can go with helping them do their traditional ways of doing things. And it doesn't quite work when it comes from tech, because they're not used to the complexity I talked about earlier. All of these different moving parts that have to kind of align together and come together in a singular strategy, right? That if you don't have that understanding and that background and don't know what a chief medical officer or a CEO of a biotech is looking for when he wants to walk into the FDA to make a compelling argument, if you don't have that background and history, then you're not going to be successful just coming from within tech. So I think the real key here is that marriage, right? How do you bring the context of old school traditional biotech with the cutting edge, right, tip of the spear technologies, and how do those work together, right? So I think the best organizations, the best investors, the best companies that have a chance to succeed are those that really integrate and create almost a matrix of these folks, right, working together. Okay. And so that is what we believe we can provide for those early technologists that are more trying to apply these new technologies from tech digital, because what we bring is all that deep expertise. Now, having said that, I've got a computational biologist who worked at the Broad on my staff, right? He's done a lot of AI, machine learning, quantum algorithms, and he knows how to dig into and critique and due diligence around the dozens of AI machine learning drug discovery platforms that we've seen ourselves, right? But I think it's that drug development expertise that we can overlay to give those companies a better chance to succeed by working with us. And that's what we're excited about. I don't want to say it's easy, but it's easier for us to assess a traditional drug technology. What do we need to do to move that forward in working with an entrepreneur? We think that we really need that collaborative spirit with the tech entrepreneur that's coming to the healthcare biotech arena or med tech or what have you.
Yeah, so you bring up some really important points. The whole thing around what Xontogeny is doing around networking, around providing other sorts of supports, partnerships, and the idea of merging biotech, so small pharma with big pharma, with tech, medical tech. At the end of the day, there's kind of an opportunity for this kaleidoscope or this confluence or these random collisions to make something bigger and better than what it is. So where does this fit around healthcare costs? At the end of the day, when you get past the gate of FDA, you suddenly hit the next one, which is who's going to pay for this thing? And if we start creating these melanges or these collaborations, the drug or the entity or the solution becomes exorbitantly more expensive. So what is the thinking around how is this done, and what is Xontogeny doing to start helping to solve some of these issues, or start thinking strategically 16 steps ahead of how you're going to get through that mire at the end of the day?
Yeah, well, one of the things that encourages me, right, is the costs of technology, the unit costs of technology go down over time, right? When you achieve scale. So when you look at, I don't know if you can go back 10 years or 20 years and what, one of those little USB memory sticks used to cost, right? And what they cost now. I mean, those things now, they really scale, Moore's law idea. And so these tools, the idea that we can have $100, right, full genome sequence done, right, this is a reality now that gives us tools to do better prediction, right? Screening, identification, whether it's, this biomarker is needed, right, to figure out if this drug works. I think that is going to aid and assist with more efficient and more predictive, hopefully, drug development. So one of the hills that I'm ready to die on is the idea that we've been inefficient as an industry in terms of R&D productivity, okay? And that we've lived with 90+% failure rates, right? For many, many decades, right? And that there are ways to be smarter with capital deployment, right? If you look at a company that spends $80 million on a similar technology to get to the same place that another company was able to do on 20 million, right? Well, then what are we doing wrong, right? With the 80 million investment. So part of it is, I think the free market, if you will reward those, right, that find better tools, better efficient approaches to doing drug development, where we don't have to rely on, well, it costs $2 billion in 10 years to get a drug approved, so that's why we have to charge X amount, right? And so if that weeds out, right, your generalist investors, sometimes we call them the tourists, right, for investing in biotech. Well, the smartest and the best are going to be figuring out how to solve for that so that they get the piece of the pie. So if the pie does not grow anymore, right? Now I can go into a different argument about how I think pharmaceuticals tend to be some of the most efficient, right, tools in our healthcare armamentarium versus the hospitals and the doctors and all of these expenses where, they represent less than 15% of the overall healthcare costs. And yet it's very efficient when you can go to your drugstore, buy a pill and potentially cure yourself if you have hepatitis C, right? So those are the things that we can do a better job as an industry to argue for. But I think as a industry professional, I'm interested in helping solve this R&D efficiency, getting better at delivering more successful clinical programs. And if we can do that, then you can really still be rewarded, right, without exorbitant costs to the healthcare system. And also generics play a big role in this. We see 75% plus of utilization are generic drugs. And that's because the innovators are incentivized, right, because they can make money and make profits by being the innovator. And then the rest of society gets that genericization. So I think that, that's maybe too big of a topic to tackle in this, 1 hour session. But I think that's how I view it, is how can we do a better job at drug development to extract some of those wasted monies from the system.
Yeah, so Chris, so absolutely true. And ultimately, it's a place or position of scalability. How do we do drug discovery bigger, better, faster, more efficiently? We've got this really slow methodology, and it kind of in some ways is the reason for it is it's sort of stuck in this legacy framework, old policies, certain regulations, legislation, the way we actually handle CROs and people paper pushing instead of entering data directly, even the idea of consent forms being these 40-page monstrosities instead of something that's very usable. So a lot of it is just old legacy frameworks. So the idea here comes down to is it's almost like a forest burning. In some ways, you almost have to burn the trees so that new saplings can grow. And this is an opportunity for completely new, and I think it's things that Xontogeny is doing, partnerships with universities, incubators, research institutions, working together to start those conversations so that you can start changing policy, start asking the big questions around bioethics, determining how you can use quantum computing, genomics, testing, doing a lot of these things that are going to change the conversation and eventually the framework at which all of this is taking place. What's Xontogeny's philosophy, long-term perspective on security, privacy, surveillance, all these population health management, all this stuff that's controversial, and how are you trying to push the envelope on these conversations?
Yeah, candidly, we're not experts in that, and we understand that, like, since the beginning of time, technology can be used for good or ill, right? And we need to have the right way to have the right protections, right? this kind of trade-off for, greater good and using data and information, right, to help solve serious diseases and cure terminal, pediatric conditions, genetic, right, disease, and, protecting privacy, right, of people. And so, I can't comment as an expert on that, but what we try to do is we do think about that trade-off, right? Everything has a risk-benefit trade-off, right? A cost-benefit to society. And what we try to do is focus on those technologies where we can hold our head up high and say, this is a travesty and we need to go and address this. And we think we can do our job by applying our experience of how to do it the right way. Because the thing that disheartens me the most is when you see a really cool technology or a really great scientific finding and they botch it up on the way to translating that, commercializing that. And then everybody's upset because they wasted all this money, investors lost, nobody has the will to restart it or do it the right way. Some do, but most don't. And so that's why I have made, my focus and priority how to do good drug development. So we take these early data sets in an animal model and turn that into a real drug that reaches patients. And so that is how we're trying to do our part. And, I think, genetic information, right, can be used for good or it can be used for ill. And I think that, we are trying to figure out how to protect patients, serve patients by using that information in the optimized ways.
Yeah, the business models for the typical biotech is very interesting. And obviously with the insurgence of money that comes from the Xontogeny fund certainly helps propel a company. You then surround them with operations and networks and all kinds of other support as they're trying to pursue their trials. And then the business model continues as you're suggesting, phase 1, phase 2, hopefully getting to a place of phase 3, and you start getting the attention of big pharma doing things like licensing agreements, research collaborations, and then maybe eventually spin out. So there is a trajectory, if you will, a life cycle of infusion of money to kind of keep these companies propelled. We're also living in a new world of new types of investments. I mean, you'd be under a rock if you didn't hear about, obviously, cryptocurrency, blockchain, NFTs, tokenization, sure. People becoming investors and workers in this. Is this something that Xontogeny is kind of opening the door to, is looking at some of these sort of more newfangled ways of investing in these companies, not necessarily in the company, but in drugs, and I'm not trying to say this is a gamble, but a lot of, you're saying retail investors are out there, they're doing sort of play-by-play gambling, there's a whole opening that's happening and it's a floodgate, and I know it's not regulated yet, but I was just curious if this is something that's in the background.
Yeah, I think we are trying to keep our eyes on this and understanding how it gets incorporated into our industry. I think right now it's largely on the periphery. But if you think blockchain, most specifically, when you think about patient data or chain of custody of supply chain or all of these things, there are real tangible ways that we could envision how these technologies, right, could be applied, to our industry. I think where we focus more of our attention is where that convergence happens at the person level, meaning how are these when I think about diagnostics, right, now you have more and more money going into finding out how you can take, better predictive power of blood samples, or, we have a technology that takes an image using your smartphone of your throat and can differentiate and differential diagnosis between a bacterial and a viral infection, right? We already know Teladoc uses where you take pictures of your skin and they can diagnose based on pictures of your skin for dermatologic conditions and whether you need, to see a doctor for that or if it's benign. So I think, we're seeing a lot of diagnostics where they're listening to your voice and changes in your voice over time, right? Or looking at your eye and looking at the movement of your eye, or looking at the makeup of the eye to see for disease, right? This technology we talked about with taking image of your throat, you can start to see detection of, is the tongue acting differently? And could that be indicative of a, pre-diagnosing a condition, right, that you might have? So I think we're very intrigued with, we've all heard of the Internet of Things. Well, now there's the Internet of Persons, right? And how can we start to use this information, right, that can be, in the cloud for real-time diagnosis, right, from, really the next generation of using your smartwatch, right, with better fidelity of information, connecting multifactorial data points to coalesce. And yeah, it's risky. We don't want false positives. That could be just as damaging. And so I think it's good that we're doing this at a slower pace. But I think if you fast forward 10 years, 20 years, I think those can be real valuable technologies versus going to your physician office and having a battery of tests, physically at one time point that only give you a very close, very simple snapshot of a given time.
It's a very exciting time. I mean, you obviously have your finger on the pulse, and there is so much change happening, Chris. And one of the things I'm wondering if you're excited about is where the patient, the health consumer, is going to land in all of this. You've talked a lot about them being technology enabled. We've talked a lot about some of the stuff that was being prophesized by, the Eric Topels and the Ray Kurzweils of everything from nanobots to, smart pills and everything that you just described. But ultimately, it comes down to this proactivity, going from a sickness to a wellness care system, and really having the patient at the center. Could you see yourself eventually having patients crowdsourcing or contacting, companies like yourself to look for drugs and to start developing, looking for entrepreneurs? I mean, what is your predictions, if you will, for where the patient's going to be, and really, tech entrepreneurs and founders, and what that relationship will look like?
Well, actually, we've been seeing this in that I worked in the rare disease area for Duchenne muscular dystrophy when I was CEO of Sarepta. And, that is where you realize how many patient advocates want to get directly involved. It might be a parent of a child with a terminal rare disease. And they're like, well, how come nobody's working on this? And how come, well, I can raise money and I can help support this, and I can find investors who have children with this condition and want to invest in those companies. And so we've worked with a lot of those parent entrepreneurs who were perfect for that, because we bring all that expertise, but we love their will, their passion, their understanding of the disease. They're watching real time the natural history of endpoints and what's important, right, to a provider of care for those patients. So I think that, John Crowley is famously known for helping find, treatments for his children, right? They made a movie about him, and he was kind of the first kind of, poster child, if you will, of a parent advocate who, made something happen. And there's been many, many others that have followed that. And so, yeah, I think you're going to see more of that. There's a woman, Julia Vitarello, who convinced the FDA to allow her daughter, who passed away recently, unfortunately, but might have had an impact on her life, quality of life, maybe extension of her life, by getting what we call an N of 1 approval, right? So I think you are seeing this convergence of the patient, the consumer starting to play more of a role. We're still in a regulated industry, so there are limitations to that. But that's where I think Xontogeny would love to embrace those and be the ones that guide them and coach them to do it the right way, so that their programs lead to success as well. And they don't end up with putting a lot of energy and money and hope into a treatment and it gets botched up along the way because they don't have the right drug developers, be by their side.
I think it's a wonderful positive note to lead at the top of the hour here. I am super excited and motivated by what Xontogeny is doing. You're doing something very brave. You're doing something extremely important, and I'm super excited. And congratulations again for the recent raise and some of the funding of some of those very exciting companies. For anybody who's listening and is intrigued and interested to find out how you might be able to collaborate, partner, find out more about some of, the venture fund or some of the recent upstarts that are happening, all kinds of exciting things happening. We will be leaving Chris's credentials and contact information, so please look for those in the show notes. He'd be very happy to speak with you. If you enjoyed this conversation, we'd also encourage you to check out impetusdigital.com. This is precisely the kinds of things that we do using a series of asynchronous and synchronous virtual touch points. So bringing players like entrepreneurs, startup companies with payers, patients, physicians through a series of touch points to find out, how do I bring my drug forward? How do I actually overcome some of the FDA challenges? Do working groups, work through policy, try to sort through all these things and do this all virtually with white glove service that we actually help to handle and manage. So something that if you're interested in looking and working in collaboration, we'd love to hear from you. Please like and subscribe to this channel, and we would love if you could leave us a review on the podcast. We want to thank everybody for their time. And Chris, this has just been an outstanding conversation. We could have literally spoken for a few more hours, and wishing everybody a wonderful day ahead.